Let's look at what fencing can teach us about how to cut with knives in a knife fight more efficiently so you don't get your hand chopped off. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now I am a fencing instructor, I have been for 20 plus years, and as well as teaching people how to use various types of sword, I've also dabbled in the knife and dagger parts of HEMA, that is historical European martial arts. And that's something we do spar with knives. When we look at, for example, World War II manuals, for example the one by Biddle, there are certain aspects of fencing principles and fencing basics that you can apply to the use of knives and bayonets, daggers, stuff like this. And that does absolutely apply from a fencing point of view. Not to say that all knife systems throughout history from across the world have used that, but I think it's worth thinking about, even if you do Filipino martial arts, Japanese martial arts, Chinese martial arts, whatever, it is worth looking at European fencing. So what can European fencing teach us about how to use the edge of our knives in a knife fight? Well, before we delve into that topic, we're going to have a brief word from our kind sponsors for this video, who are the awesome Raid Shadow Legends. As millions of you out there already know, Raid's the hugely popular turn-based fantasy combat game that you can play on your mobile phone or PC right now for free. Raid's the first game to bring a console level of game experience to your mobile phone. You can do combat using over 600 champions and hundreds of artifacts. Now my favourite 3 champions are, well, this is the first one, this is Kaitis. He's a Knight's Revenant. Black and yellow armour, totally awesome, very hard to kill. My favourites is Ninja, that's right, and he's level 40, I've maxed him out, he's got an awesome bow. And my third favourite champion that I'm currently using is the Elder Skarg. I've got him up to maximum level 50. So what's new in Raid? Well, this month Raid's just released a giant new feature, Awakening, and a brutal new dungeon, the Iron Twins Fortress. If you're good enough to take down the Iron Twins, you'll see a huge payoff, being able to awaken your champions. Awakening your champions lets you choose a powerful blessing that can transform how they perform in battle. I absolutely love how awesome some of these blessings look, and there's so much variety. The whole feature has added an entire new level of depth and strategy, and I'm having a ton of fun playing around and testing things out right now. But wait, here's the really massive news. Raid's just released a super-powered legendary version of everybody's favourite champion, Death Knight. The Raid community's been waiting for this for a long time, and Ultimate Death Knight is everything that we hoped for. He's poised, he's powerful, he's perfect. And the best part is, everyone can get him for free just by logging in. All you've got to do is log in and play Raid for 7 days between now and October the 27th. And you'll get Ultimate Death Knight added to your collection of champions. It's that easy. There's never been a better time to get playing Raid. But wait, there's more. You can use the promo code DKRises for a bunch of free items to instantly level your new strongest champion all the way to level 50 5-star Ascension. And this promo is for everybody, whether you're a new or an existing player. And if you're not playing Raid already, then you can start playing for free right now by using the link down there in the description box, or the QR code on screen, and you will get bonuses worth $30 right now. We're talking about a free epic champion, Aina, 200k silver, 1 energy refill and 1 XP boost, and 1 ancient shard, so that you can summon an awesome champion as soon as you get into the game. All of that treasure is going to be waiting for you up here in the inbox, and remember, this is only for new players and only for the next 30 days. So get playing, give it a go right now. Getting back to the main topic for this video, which is what can fencing teach us about how to use the edges of our knives in knife fighting? Well, first thing is, what type of knives? Well, fundamentally, obviously, we're talking about a knife that can cut here. And that varies hugely. It could be anything from a kitchen knife to a relatively small hunting knife type thing, up to the big Bowie knife that I was holding a second ago, to really massive kind of Bowie variants or machetes and things like that, via things like the kukri and equally the barong. Okay, so Filipino weapons of various sorts and various other things. So any knife that has some cutting capacity, and obviously different size knives and different breadth knives, different edge geometry knives have different capacity to cut more or less effectively. Everything's a compromise. So something that you make bigger is also going to be heavier, perhaps more cumbersome, in some situations difficult to bring to bear within the fight. Something like a small Fairbairn Sykes commando dagger, for example, does have a little bit of cutting capacity, but it's really a specialized thrusting dagger. So they are different things. So bear in mind, everything I will say in this video will be more or less applicable to different types of dagger, and you might have to modify the weight you give to certain things, or how applicable some of the things I say are to a given type of knife or dagger. Right. So the first thing I want to say is, building upon my previous video, which I titled Take the Hand, Lessons from Biddle, World War II, he was actually training in boxing and various forms of combatives and knife use, fencing, bayonet use, all the way up to World War II, and then in World War II trained, well, it's not known how many, but tens of thousands probably, of US Marines in World War II. Now, he specifically developed a system for using the bayonet, which is, I don't have a bayonet to hand at the moment actually, but is a large knife, let's say at that time roughly equivalent to a Bowie knife. Now, funnily enough, he had trained in Bowie knife methods, but he'd also trained in fencing. So, putting Biddle to aside for a second, him and a whole bunch of other sources and various people training martial arts today and teaching combatives and self-defense and all things like that, agree on the basic fact that with a average size or largish knife sized object, the most effective way of taking an opponent out of the fight is the use of the point, okay? Now, we're not going to talk necessarily in this video about the biological effects of point versus edge. That also has an relative merit depending on what the people are wearing. So if they're wearing thick military clothing with multiple layers, winter clothing, stuff like this, then obviously a point can get through thick clothing better than an edge can. Edges are not very good at going through clothing, but that's again another topic, a different topic for a different video. But the fact is that certain knives are designed to both thrust and cut, but even though they can thrust and cut, they are predominantly used as thrusting implements. Now, my opinion is that something like a Bowie knife, even, and this might be controversial, even something like a barong should be primarily in a fight used as a thrusting implement. It has, for three reasons, okay? One is the question of penetration and biology. It's easiest to get through clothes. It also has the most fatal effect on the target, number one. Number two is it is the longest reaching attack. Okay, what do I mean by that? Well, quite simply, if I were to cut someone in most situations, although you can rake the point across the target, in most situations the edge would being applied down here, whereas the point starts to be applied up here. Although, to give fair due, it will enter the target and come down to about the same region that the cut would be acting on the target. Okay? The other point is directness. Now, you might be thinking I'm talking about speed here. Kind of not, okay? The fact is that the whole a thrust is quicker than a cut has been, I believe, widely debunked for a whole bunch of reasons that I won't go into here. But more or less, apart from the fact that it hits slightly sooner because it is slightly closer, more or less there isn't a huge time difference between a thrust and a cut, okay? But what do I mean by directness? Well, it's about exposing yourself to the opponent. Now, that might not sound like what you're thinking. What it means is, when you are fighting an opponent, this is where we're getting into fencing principles now. When you're fighting an opponent, you start in some kind of guard position. It might be something like this. It might be something like this. It could potentially even be something like that. There's a starting position that you commence a fight in. You know, for a boxer, with modern gloves, it might be up here. In pugilism without gloves, it might be down here. But the fact is, you have a starting position. And this is true of any fencing, sword-based fencing system, even bayonet-based fencing system as well. So you have a starting position. In Victorian fencing, incidentally, we'd call this the engaging guard. It's the position that you engage the enemy with. So let's say that my starting position is somewhere around here, which is a sort of combination knife fighting, saber fencing stance, okay? If I'm going to attack an opponent, if I'm going to directly attack them with a thrust, all I have to do is extend the arm. Okay, so it is the most direct thing that I can do from my starting position here. Okay, now you might think, well, isn't that true of all weapons and all swords? No, not necessarily. Okay, so now we're going to go back into the mists of time and talk about swords for a second. So if we go back into the medieval period, then we have obviously longer blades of various sorts. This is a weapon called a langmesser. Okay, so this is a medium length sword of the 15th century. This one happens to have a knuckle bow, but many of them don't. It happens to have a nagel, and certainly most langmesser have nagel, but lots of falchions, for example, don't. Now, We do not, in medieval fencing systems, always start out in this position at all. This is a position we could start out in. Usually the hand would be behind the back for various reasons. But this often won't be a point forward position, starting position, won't be the starting position we often start in medieval systems. Why? Because the hand's too vulnerable. Okay, so in later fencing systems, you'll often point forward with the arm more or less extended like this. Okay, if I was using a sabre, and I'll just grab a German one, Prussian one here. If I'm point forward here, my point is well towards the opponent. I've got a degree of hand guard, and I'm essentially keeping my distance, my measure, with the blade of the sword, and I'm keeping the point towards them. Okay, which might sound like common sense, but practice and the treatises, so the sources that we study from the medieval period, show us that this is not a particularly good thing to do with medieval swords, because if you spend a lot of time with the hand forward, then you will get hit in the hand. Okay, now this is true of knife fighting as well, but we'll come back to knife fighting in a second. Therefore, in medieval sword systems, often we find positions like this, or this will be off camera because you can't see it, behind the body down here, or to the side of the body here, which is incidentally the position the sword first starts off in a scabbard, so it's good to practice fighting from this position because you'll often have to draw the sword out from that position anyway. So these guard positions have the hand withdrawn. So how do we attack from here? Well, you can attack. If we start here or wherever with the hand back, you can attack in exactly the same way with a direct forwards motion with the point, okay? So it could be from above, or I could drop the hand down below as I come forwards, okay? So I could start here or here, and I'm still attacking straight forwards with the point from here. Okay, exactly like I was doing with the knife. So I'm still transitioning through that position whereby if I'm coming from here and dropping the hand down and thrusting towards someone's face, I'm still transitioning through a close position to if I started fencing from here. But instead of here where my hand's vulnerable, I'm starting here where my hand's safe, and then at the moment of wanting to attack, I can come from here. Incidentally, if I want to defend, I can instantly bring the hand out to defend for that split second, and then bring it back to my guard position. So in medieval systems, we often see a way of keeping the hand back, and you only commit it forward into like the danger zone in the moment of attack or in the moment of defense. If we cut from here, and this is where it's pertinent to this video, if we cut from here, this would be called vom Tag or Guardia di Alta or Posti di Donna in various systems. If we attack with a cut from here, it's a direct motion forwards. Okay, we're starting, the arm is already loaded, and all we're doing is we're unloading it. Now, if we come forward to later fencing systems, let's grab a sabre here. We're starting with the hand forward, as aforementioned, and part of the reason for this is once we get into the age of things like side swords and rapiers, and then later on back swords and sabres, we've got hand protection, so we can spend more of the time with the weapon presented more forwards, and also having the point towards the opponent, because we've now got more thrust-centric systems, and debatably. Also having the blade in front of the hand also helps protect it because it's got a long blade. Okay, with a short blade that doesn't apply so much. Okay, so we've got the point forward, we've got the hand guard in front of the hand, we've got the hand forward. How do we cut from here? Well, quite simply, we've got a problem, because remember in the medieval system, we're already starting with the hand back here, or here, or here. So to cut, all we have to do, as well as making a step or a lunge, which I won't do at the moment because I don't have space and I'll disappear off camera if I do that. Let's just look at the upper body for now. If I want to make a cut from here, all I have to do is move essentially in a straight line with my hand. Anyway, the tip of the sword moves in an arc, but the hand moves in a straight line towards the target, and I hit it. Okay, whether it's from here or whether it's from here. So that's not a problem at all with the medieval system when the hand's back. But now we've got the hand forward. If I were to go, okay, so I'm going to hit a person, I'm going to pull my hand back, and then I'm going to hit them. Here's a problem, okay? Because you have got your measure, you've got your opponent in front of you here, you've got the threat of the sword. What you're now doing is you're moving the sword backwards, back, away from them, taking away the threat, exposing your arm and your hand, losing your ability to control this distance, before you can then move the sword forwards again, okay? With the medieval system, you're already starting with the hand back, unless you happen to be in a point-centric guard, which is a different thing, but you're starting with the hand back, and all you have to do in that split second is move forwards. So it's all threat, it's all going towards the other person. What I don't want to be doing is creating a system where I'm bringing my hand away from a person, taking away all threat and exposing my body and arm before I can then transition and transport the blade back towards them and take the threat to them. So what do I do? Well, what we do is what we do usually with sabre. Okay, what we usually do with sabre is something called a Moolinay. Now, for those of you who've been following my channel for years, you will know only too well what this is. I'm actually going to switch for this to a shorter sword because this blade can touch my ceiling, so I want to be able to demonstrate it with a shorter blade, but this would normally be done with a sabre. So if we're starting with the hand forward here and we want to cut, instead of bringing the whole arm back in order to then cut, what we instead do is we turn the sword around the wrist. Okay, so you keep the arm forward, you keep the threat forward, the tip of the blade moves in a circle, bam, but you're not bringing the arm and the hand back in order to cut. Now I could add more power to the blow by doing this, but be aware of the fact that generally speaking, when you do this, you expose this arm and you take the threat away from the opponent before you then actually launch the cut. So we do a Moolinay. Now, just brief tangent to mention, there are sabre systems which rotate, for example, from the elbow, mass yellow for an example, okay? Now, in that case, he's starting out of distance, and what he's actually doing, in my opinion, is he's starting the rotation from the elbow, and then he's not travelling forward into the danger zone until he makes the lunge. So at the point that he starts to travel forward, the blade, the sword, the arm, the hand is now only moving forwards. Okay, so it's not a problem in that case. So you use distance slightly differently. With a Moolinay, you could theoretically start moving forwards as soon as you start doing the turn of the hand, because you're not exposing the arm or anything else. All of the motion's coming from here. So let's bring it back to knife fighting. So if you've seen the Biddle video, you will know that one of the counters he does whenever someone attacks with a knife, he's got a knife as well, is he essentially countercuts the hand, okay? So the attacks will normally be a thrust, and the counters will often be a cut into the person's hand or arm. This strongly relates to all of the fencing stuff with sabre that we've just been looking at. Now, clearly you could take a larger knife. We go back to the massive barong here, for example. This applies here as well. It means that if you're starting here, say with the point forward, and you want to cut someone, what you really shouldn't do is step in and do this, okay? Or step in and do this. Because as soon as you step in and do that or that, what you're doing is you're taking the threat away, the weapon away from the front of your body, you're exposing your arm and your hand, you're coming into the danger zone, and yes, there is the threat of that coming crashing down on the opponent, but in that moment, they have the ability with their knife, as your hand goes up, to either just go cut straight into it, or stab, potentially, or block straight into it, and remember, a block can be done offensively as well with an edged weapon. So if a person's in front of you and goes like this, what you can do is move in on them and slam your edge straight into their arm, whichever direction it is, either side, up, down, wherever. Additionally, you could potentially, as they do this, you could go in and counter it with your arm, either just forming a fence or a guard, as we call it, or actually going to grab or encounter their arm at the same time, in single tempo, in other words, as stabbing as well. So if you've got an opponent here and they raise their arm up to do a big slash, in that moment you can cover their arm, blocking arm against arm, and stab them in the same moment. So exposing your arm, lifting up, especially if you're doing it as coming into range, and as mentioned with mass yellow, what we could do is we could do this and then move into range. That's absolutely a valid option, and we'll talk more about that in a second. But here's another thought. Why didn't we use one of the options from sabre fencing, the Moolinay? Okay, so if we're starting forward here with the blade forwards, okay, and we want to cut for some reason, then why not keep the arm forward. Don't lift it up, don't pull it back here. Instead, rotate around the wrist as you do the lunge. Okay? Now, it's not going to be the most powerful cut in the world, but I tell you, I get hit by these on a regular basis. It's got enough force with a sharp edge to lay things open that need to be laid open. Okay? So, absolutely, you can use the Moolinay, and the most powerful one, incidentally, is the number 1, because it transitions through 180 degrees. So it comes around here, there, to there. Okay, so you see the angle from there to there, 180 degrees. If you went from here, a cut number 2, that's going to be less powerful, but you can do cut 3s with a Moolinay, but the cut 1 is the most common one. And you can thrust. So, without really exposing the arm and the hand hardly at all, you absolutely can rotate around the wrist. Okay, so I would say that's one of the safest ways to give an opening cut. If for some reason you want to go for an opening cut, I'd say most of the time open with a thrust. That's one of the safest ways to do it, is with a Moolinay. Don't pull the arm back, although if for some reason, and I know that there are some martial arts from now where they might do this, if you do want to pull the arm back, you have to be very, very wary of your distance management and only commit to moving forwards into range, i.e. lunging in this case, as the blade is now travelling forwards. So you could load it here if we're going from the elbow, load, 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 then unload with the movement forward. Okay, so load, move forward as you move the blade forward. However, I would say that's still needlessly exposing the hand and arm to the countercut. If you instead just did it with the Moolinay, you're not really exposing at all, because the blade is staying almost, although the tip of the blade's moving behind, the weapon is staying forwards and in front of your arm. Just briefly also to add that as well as chopping cuts or cuts that come from a Moolinay like we're talking about here, there is another type of cut which is called a push cut. Of course, there can be a pull cut as well, but for the purposes of this video, really a push cut is most applicable. Now, I've spoken a lot here about the thrust being a preferred mode of attack, but actually for whatever reason, sometimes you miss with the point, the edge will actually run up, and this is a form of cut. And if you want to, you can do this deliberately. Now, you could get into questions of why would you choose to do a push cut instead of a thrust, but they're basically the same motion. So just to mention that as well as the type of cutting motion that we're talking about here, be it with a full arm or with a Moolinay, you can also do something that's like a thrust but is a pushing cut. So we've looked a little bit at the barong, but how might this apply to something like a kukri, for example? A kukri is a very forwards weighted weapon that really wants to chop. Now, absolutely, with this, you can do the Moolinay. Okay, you can actually do a really quick and tight Moolinay from here that will have, because of the tip heavy nature and the curve of the blade and the belly of the blade, this will still have an awful lot of force on the target. If there's an interest in it, I can demonstrate this on bottles or branches, freshly cut wood, whatever, tatami mats if I can get hold of some. They're quite difficult to get hold of in the UK. But absolutely, instead of a person going like this with a kukri and then chopping down, the moment they do that, you're taking the threat away from the opponent, you're exposing the arm to a counter cut or a thrust at the body if they're using a bayonet or something like this. Or just a person just charging in and blocking the arm, because remember, bam, that is something that you can block, grab, manipulate, everything else, or just grabbing the bottom up here up by the pommel. Instead of doing that, you can absolutely do a really powerful Moolinay just purely from the wrist movement and with a little lunge step, a half lunge as we call it. Okay, so that's one thing. The second thing is that if for some reason you are committed to the idea of raising the arm to give a cut, either to the left or to the right or above, wherever, if you're committed to doing this, you have to understand distance management, which is again something that fencing will teach you. You do not want to be stepping in as you're doing this. You want to do this and then step in, so that a bit like the medieval sword guard, like vom Tag, your forwards motion of the sword or knife is accompanied with the forwards motion of your foot. So at the moment that you're doing this, you are technically out of distance to be hit, hopefully. If you get your distance management wrong, then this, against a good fencer, is going to lead to you being defeated. So hopefully that's been relatively clear in that the Moolinay enables you to cut whilst exposing yourself the least. If you lift or bend the arm up at all, that exposes you the most, and therefore you have to defend yourself with distance if you're going to do a system that does that, whereas keeping the weapon in front of you exposes you less. However, I just wanted to finish up mentioning there is one time that you can do a full bellied chop or cut, and that is after guarding with your weapon. What do I mean by that? Well, quite simply, it doesn't matter what type of knife you're using, it could be a barong or a bowie knife or whatever. If your opponent has attacked you first and you have defended against it with the knife in either direction, which requires you, even if you start in this position, to bring your weapon closer to your body and bring the point offline. So if we're starting in what we call terse or medium guard, and someone attacks this side of my head with another type of big knife or a machete or something like this, I am likely to guard that. I might try and countercut into the arm, but if I don't get the time to, or the distance isn't right, or I just wasn't quite on the ball, then I just stick my weapon in the way to protect myself from being chopped. Okay, now that could be point up, that could be point down. In this specific example, you can see that when I do this, I bring the arm closer to the body and I bend it, okay, whether it's point down or whether it's point up. In bending the arm, not only am I defending myself, but I'm also loading myself for my response, for my riposte, as we call it. So if I defend here, then now my arm's bent and I can, bam, I can unload with a full arm motion with that cut. Equally, if I did it point down here, I might take over with the arm, so I might guard with the knife, then take over that guard line with the arm, and then I've got a full arm extension, bending the elbow, wrist and shoulder in that resulting cut. So very often, and we can extrapolate this all the way back to a smaller bowie knife, very often the best cuts will be ripostes, okay, as well as counters. So we've talked about when someone attacks, thrusts or cuts, you just cut into their arm. But in some cases, you might have tried to do that and you might have encountered their blade, or you might have cut them in the arm anyway. You might have a natural cut from there because at this point of having defended in whatever way you have, you might find that your arm is now bent and therefore loaded, and you can unload it with a powerful cut. Okay, so to summarize and conclude, if you're starting in a point forward position, my advice is to cut from the wrist because this exposes you the least. If for some reason you want to cut with the whole arm, which isn't usually a good thing to do from a starting position, usually thrust or cut from the wrist. If you want to cut from the arm for some reason, then make sure that you're doing it, you start out of distance and then only move into distance once the weapon's moving forwards. And finally, you can do these full-bellied big chops, but they'll often work best after guarding, okay? So when someone goes to hit you, you guard, then you unwind. You guard, then you unwind. Okay, I hope that's been interesting, folks. Check out the links below. I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon. I have been Matt Easton, and I will be again next time. Thanks for watching. See you soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.